My wife and I were in London on the night before the Trooping of the Colour, and we had friends for dinner, and we went to the restaurant, met them for dinner. In the course of dinner, with our guest, who is the chairman of a very prominent and highly successful and reputable British FSA-controlled financial institution, he asked me if I could help him in getting identification of the validity of people who had brought to him a huge transaction for a corporate reconstruction. And could I help him by validating people, because he knew that I had connections from the past where I could get onto various intelligence agencies and establish the validity of people. That's how it started.
And what is it that they're offering?
They're representing themselves as a massive supranational accumulation of funds which are not sovereign national foreign funds, but are the proceeds of a massive amount of commercial activity which have accumulated over probably most of 100 years. And they are concerned that they have all this wealth in a world which is beginning to lose its track on its own economic progress and stability, and they want to put their assets to work to help save the world.
So they think that by helping plug the UK debt, they'll boost their own wealth.
They're quite directly saying, no, they're not. They're saying that they will protect the wealth of the world so that they will continue to survive with their wealth in it. But they are saying quite particularly that they want the United Kingdom to take a leading initiative in this, because they see us as being the logical point from which they can deploy a lot of their support into the European sector, which they think is in dire need of help and support at this time.
And you believe that this is a genuine offer and not a hoax?
I've been working on this now with them for 21 weeks. They have not put a foot wrong in 21 weeks. They have never contradicted themselves or said anything which would give a lie to anything that they have said. And therefore, from that point of view, I am progressively comfortable with the genuineness of their approach. They have gone out of their way to ask me to introduce them to government officials within the coalition with whom they can talk to open this up. And there has been a natural high level of scepticism, because it's rather like finding, after all these years, the good gracious, you find on Christmas Eve that Father Christmas really does exist and he's just popped down your chimney, and it is a bit of a surprise. So the government officials have voiced a lot of scepticism, and the people I'm dealing with from X have been forthcoming with a list of referees who they've quoted, who are amongst the most powerful and the most high-profile people on the whole world stage, and they've invited the British government to pick up a phone to these people to validate their existence. Provided that the British government do so at the highest level of security, they will then talk to people at the highest level of security on the world stage who will validate them. This has so far, I understand, not happened at that level, because the government in this country decided that I must be a maverick old peer who'd lost his marbles, and that they couldn't really trust this at all, and therefore they should look to see more rationally if it was feasible. And they came up with two major objections to the proposal which was being put forward, and said this means it couldn't be true. And I've looked very carefully at those two objections, and I think that the government has misunderstood completely and has come up to the wrong conclusions, and I've said that in my speech on Monday night.
And what made you speak on Monday publicly?
I have so far not succeeded in getting it proven because the British government officials have not yet taken it up. This was a debate about the impact of the strategic spending review and what it was going to have as an impact on society, and down to levels of deprivation and concern which were being voiced very strongly by the socialist opposition on the benches opposite. And I therefore spoke about it on Monday because it seemed to me that the opposition benches were overreacting, and that probably nothing was going to be quite as bad as they were saying it would be, but it could be a great deal better if we could really get GDP back into growth, which clearly what is being offered by X will have a massive impact on our GDP, in which case we could probably generate a far faster recovery to overcome a lot of the deprivation problems long before they occurred, according to the script that the socialist opposition were pushing to us.
And if this did go ahead, what would it look like? What would it mean for Britain?
It would mean a massive improvement in the job market, because so much of what they're doing is aimed at creating infrastructure which is headcount intensive. For example, the things that they're proposing at the present moment, since Monday they have said to me that if the government will now give an answer to them now as to whether they will support this, and by now I think they mean in the course of the next week, then X will put up and have in our bank by Christmas Day the entire £17 billion we need to build Crossrail now and bring it forward from the 10-year distant date it is. And think how many jobs that will create and the impact that will have on the vitality of London and everything else that will go with it. That creates GDP, which is wealth, and that brings money into the equation. But they're also quite specifically saying, look, you can't afford to hang back on your renewable energy policy. So if you have a preferred policy at this moment to do the underground gasification of coal and the conversion of your power stations to use underground gasification of coal, we will pay for that as well. But your spending review has also taken out all the hospitals and the schools that you needed to build, and we'll build those for you as well.
And would this money come with strings attached?
It comes interest-free, and it comes with no requirement to guarantee the value when it is paid back, and it comes with no repayment schedule, so it can be with us for as long as we need it. I'm going to have to make a very big apology to my noble friend, the noble Lord Sassoon, because I'm about to raise a subject which I shouldn't raise, and which is going to be one which I think is now time to put on a higher awareness and to explain to the House as a whole, as I don't think they have any knowledge of. I'm sorry the noble Lord Strathclyde is not with us at the moment, because this deeply concerns him also. But for the last 20 weeks, since yesterday afternoon, I have been engaged in a very strange dialogue with the two noble lords, in the course of which I've been trying to bring to their attention the willing availability of a strange organisation which wishes to make a great deal of money available to assist the recovery of the economy in this country. For want of a better description of their name, I'll call them Foundation X. It's not their real name, but it'll do for the moment. Foundation X was introduced to me 20 weeks ago last week by a very eminent city firm, FSA controlled, by its chairman, who came to me, and its chairman said, we have this extraordinary request to assist in doing this major financial reconstruction. It's mega bucks, but we need your help to assist us in understanding whether this business is legitimate. I had the biggest put down of my life from the noble Lord Strathclyde when I told him this story first of all. He said, why you? You're not important enough to have the answer to a question like that. And he's quite right. My noble lord, I'm not important enough, but the answer to the next question was, you haven't got the experience for it. Yes, I do. I have had one of the biggest experiences in the laundering of terrorist money and of funny money that anybody's had in the city. I've handled billions of terrorist money. Not into my pocket. The biggest terrorist client I had was the IRA, and I'm pleased to say that I managed to write off more than £1 billion of their money. I've also had extensive connections with North African terrorists, but that's of a far nastier nature, and I don't want to talk about that because that's still a security issue. I would also hasten to add, it's no use getting the police in for me, because I shall immediately call the Bank of England as my defence witness, as they put me in to deal with these problems. So the point is that I was, in the course of doing this very strange activity, I got a very interesting set of phone numbers and references which I could go to for help when I needed it. And so people in the city have known that if they want to check out anything that looks at all odd, they can come to me and I can press a few phone numbers and get a reference. And so they came to me and asked me whether I would get them a reference and a clearance on Foundation X. And for 20 weeks I've been endeavouring to do so. I myself have come to the absolute conclusion that they are completely genuine and sincere, and that they are quite directly wishing to make the United Kingdom one of the principal points for which they will use to disseminate their extraordinary great wealth into the world at this present moment as part of an attempt to seek the economic recovery of the global economy. And so I made the phone call to my noble friend Lord Strathclyde on a Sunday afternoon. I think he was sitting on his lawn, poor man. And he did the quickest ball pass I've ever seen. If England can do anything like it at Twickenham on Saturday, we have a chance against the All Blacks. And the next thing I knew, I'd got the noble Lord Sassoon on the phone instead. And he, from the outset, took the quite right, proper defensive attitude of total scepticism and said, this possibly can't be right. In the course of the following weeks, I had first of all, the noble Lord Sassoon said, go and talk to the Bank of England. So I phoned the governor of the Bank of England and said, could he please check this out for me? And he came back after about 3 days and said, you can get lost. I'm not touching this with a barge pole. It's far too difficult. Take it back to the Treasury. So I did. And within another day, the noble Lord Sassoon had come back and said, this is rubbish. It can't possibly be right. So I said, well, I'm going to work more on it. And then I had a meeting with the noble Lord Strathclyde, and I actually bought one of the senior executives from Foundation X to meet Lord Strathclyde. I have to say that as first dates go, it was not a great success. Neither of them ended up by inviting the other one up for a coffee or a drink at the end of the evening, and they didn't exchange telephone numbers in order to be able to follow up the call. In fact, I found myself between a rock and a hard place, represented by both a rock and a hard place, which were totally paranoid about each other. Because the Foundation X people have got an amazing obsession with their own security. They are expecting only to be contacted by somebody equal to head of state status, or somebody who has an international security rating equal to the top 6 people in the world. And this is such a strange situation. So both the noble Lord Sassoon and the noble Lord Strathclyde both came up with what should have been an absolute killer argument as to why this could not be true and we should forget it. Noble Lord Sassoon's argument first was that these people were offering evidence, or they claimed evidence, that they had lodged £5 billion with British banks last year. And they gave dates and they gave transfer dates and the details of these transfers. And as noble Lord Sassoon said, if that was true, it would stick out like a sore thumb. You couldn't have £5 billion popping out of a bank account without it disrupting the balance sheet completely. But I remember that about the same time that those transfers were being made, the noble Lord Miners was indulging in his game of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic of the British banking community. And if he had 3 banks at that time, which had had, say, a deficiency of £1.5 billion each, then you'd pretty well have absorbed the entire £5 billion, and you wouldn't have the sore sum stick out on this at that time, because you'd have put £1.5 billion into each of 3 banks, and you'd have lost the lot, or absorbed the lot. That would be a logical explanation. I don't know. Noble Lord Strathclyde came up with a much different argument. He said, this cannot be right. This cannot be right, because these people said at the meeting with him that they were still effectively on the gold standard from back in the 1920s, and that their entire currency holdings throughout the world, which were very large, were backed by bullion. And the noble Lord Strathclyde came back and said to me, he'd had his analysts working on it, and this has to be stuff and nonsense. Because he said they had come up with a figure for the amount of bullion that would have been needed to cover their currency reserves as claimed, which would be more than the entire value of bullion that had ever been mined in the history of the world. I'm sorry, but the noble Lord Strathclyde is wrong. His analysts are wrong, because what he had done was he had tapped into the sources which are available, and there is only one definitive source for the amount of bullion that has ever been taken from the Earth's crust. And that was a National Geographic magazine article 12 years ago. And whatever figure it was that they quoted was then quoted again by 6 other sites on the internet, on Google. And so everybody's quoting one original source, and there is no other confirming authority. But if you tack into the Vatican accounts of the Vatican Bank, you come up with a claim of total bullion.
The noble Lord is into his 15th minute. I wonder if he could draw his remarks to conclusion.
The total value of the Vatican Bank reserves would claim to be more than the entire value of gold ever mined in the history of the world. Now, my point on all of this is that we have not proven any of this. Foundation X are saying at this present moment that they are prepared to put up the entire £5 billion for the funding and creation of the 3i recreation. The British government can have the entire independent management and control of it. They don't want anything to do with it. There will be no interest charged. And by the way,
if the British government would like it as well, if it will help, they will be prepared to put up money for funding hospitals, schools, the building of Crossrail immediately with 17 billion transfer by Christmas if requested, and all these other things. These things can be done if wished, but we have to have a senior member of the government has to accept the invitation to a phone call to the chairman of the company concerned, Foundation X, and then we can get into business. And all I'm asking is that this is too big an issue. I'm just an aging, obsessive old peer, and I'm easily dispensable, but getting to the truth is not. And we need to know what really is happening here. My Lords, we must find out the truth of this situation. My Lords, I'm going to start, I don't wish you to get too encouraged by that. I'm going to start with my conclusions, but I'm not going to sit down when I've made them, because I'm going then to give you the evidence to support them, and hopefully present to you the reasons why I want support for an official inquiry into the mischief I want to unfold to yourselves this afternoon. My Lords, I've been engaged in this pursuit of this issue for nearly 2 years now, and I'm no further through to getting to the truth. I think there are 3 possible conclusions which may come from it. I think there may have been a massive piece of money laundering committed by a major government which ought to know better, and that it has effectively undermined the integrity of a British bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, in doing so. The second alternative is that a major American department has an agency which has gone rogue on it because it has been wound up and has created a structure out of which they are seeking to get, well, at least 50 billion euros as a payoff. And the third possibility is that this is an extraordinary elaborate fraud which has not been carried out, but which has been prepared in order to provide a threat to one government or more if they don't pay them off. So there are 3 possibilities, and this all needs a very urgent review. My Lords, it starts in April and May of 2009 with the alleged transfer to the United Kingdom, to the HSBC, of a sum of $50 trillion, and 7 days later, ping, in comes another $50 trillion to the HSBC, and then 3 weeks later, another $50 trillion, total of $5 trillion in each case, sorry. Total of $15 trillion is alleged to have been passed into the hands of HSBC for onward transit to the Royal Bank of Scotland, and we need to look to where this came from and what the history of this money is, and I have been trying to sort out the sequence by which this money has been created and where it's come from for a long time. It starts off apparently as the property of a man called Johannes Rayardi, who has some claims to be considered the richest man in the world. Well, he would be if all the money that was owed to him was paid, but I have seen accounts of his showing he owns $36 trillion in a bank, and it is a ridiculous sum of money. On the other hand, the $36 trillion would be consistent with the dynasty from which he comes and the fact that they had been effectively the emperors of Indochina in times gone by. But a lot of that money has been taken away from him with his consent by the American Treasury over the years for the specific purpose of helping to support the dollar. And he has sent to me a really quite remarkable document which is dated in February 2006, in which the American government have called him to a meeting with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is neither Federal Reserve nor a bank. It's a bit like Celebrity Big Brother. It's got 3 names to describe it, and none of them are true. And this document, which is quite astonishing, purports to have been a meeting which is witnessed by Mr. Alan Greenspan, who signed for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of which he was chairman, as well as the real Federal Reserve Bank in Washington. And it is signed by Mr. Timothy Geithner, who as a witness on behalf of the International Monetary Fund, who sent 2 witnesses, the other one being Mr. Yusuke Horiguchi. And these gentlemen have signed as witnesses to the effect that this deal is a proper deal. There are a lot of other signatures on here. This is not a photocopy, this is an original version of the contract, under which the American Treasury have apparently got the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to offer to buy out the bonds which have been issued to Mr. Rayadi to replace the cash which has been taken from him over the previous 10 years. And they're giving him half of $500 million as a cash payment to buy out worthless bonds. Now, this is all in the agreement, and it's very remarkable. I would have thought establishing whether this is a correct piece of paper or not is just 2 phone calls away, one to Mr. Geithner and one to Mr. Greenspan, both of whom still prosper and live, so they could easily confirm whether they signed this. Mr. Rayadi has, by passing these bonds over, also put at the disposal of the US Treasury the entire asset backing which he was alleged to have for the 15 trillion. I now have a letter here from the Bank of Indonesia which says that the whole thing was a pack of lies, that he did not have the 750,000 tons of gold which was supposed to be backing it. He only had 700 tons. And this is really a piece of complete fabrication. Finally, I have a letter here from Mr. Rayadi himself, who tells me that he was put up to do this and none of it was true, and that he has been robbed of all his money. And I'm quite prepared to recognize that one of the possibilities here is that Mr. Rayadi is himself putting this together as a forgery in order to go and try and win some recovery back. But it gets more complicated than that, because each of the 5 trillion payments that came in has been acknowledged and receipted by the senior executives of HSBC, and again receipted by the executives of the Royal Bank of Scotland. And I have a set of the whole of those receipts for all of this money. Why would any bank want to sign £5 trillion worth, $5 trillion worth, 15 trillion in total, of receipts if the money didn't exist? The money was said to have come, first of all, from the Rayadi account to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York it was passed to JP Morgan Chase in New York for onward transit to London. The means of sending it was a SWIFT note, which ought to have been registered with the Bank of England if it was genuine. So when this happened and came about, I first of all took it to my noble friend Lord Strathclyde and said, what do we do with this? He said, give it to Lord Sassoon, he's the Treasury. So we did, and Lord Sassoon looked at it and said immediately, this is rubbish, it's far too much money, it would stick out like a sore thumb and you can't see it in the Royal Bank of Scotland accounts. Quite right. Secondly, he said, the gold backing it is ridiculous. There's only been 1,507 tons of gold mined in the history of the world, so you can't have 750,000 tons. This is true. And the third thing he said obviously was, it's a scam. And I agree with him, it was a scam. The problem is we stopped looking at that point. We should have asked, what is the scam, instead of at that time just nodding it off. And we have never really resolved this, because today I have this quite frightening piece of paper, which is my justification for bringing it into this meeting today, which is available on the internet, and I'm astonished that it hasn't already been unearthed by the Treasury, and every alarm bell in the land should be ringing if it has, because this is the General Audit Office of the Federal Reserve, the real Federal Reserve in Washington, and its audit review in end of July 2010 on the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It has on it some 20 banks listed, to which $16.115 trillion are outstanding in loans. My lords, that is the sore thumb that was being looked for by Lord Sassoon. But more particularly, there are 2 other very interesting things with this. The first is that Barclays Bank have got 868 billion of loan. The Royal Bank of Scotland has got 541 billion, in which case one has to ask, as they could have earned in 3 weeks enough to pay off their entire indebtedness to the taxpayers in Britain, why they have not done so, and could we please ask them to put a cheque in the post tonight for the whole 46 billion. And the third thing that's wrong with it is that every bank on this list, without exception, is an MTN registered bank, which means that they are registered to use medium-term notes to move funds between themselves with an agreed profit share formula. In which case, these banks are investing this money, and most extraordinary, not a penny of interest does the Federal Bank of New York want paid on this vast amount of 16 trillion. Anyone amongst yourselves who knows what the IMF rules are will immediately smell a rat. Because the IMF has very strict rules for validating dodgy money. There are two ways of doing it. You either pass it through a major central bank like the Bank of England, who had apparently refused to touch this, or alternatively, you put it through to a bank which is an MTN trading bank, and which is then able to use the funds on the overnight European MTN trading market, where they can earn between 1 and 2.5% profit per night. And the compound interest on that is huge. So there is a vast profit being made with this money somewhere if it is in fact genuine. So, my lords, I believe that this is such an important issue now that I've put everything I've got on the subject into a 104 megabyte memory thumb, and I want the government to put this to some suitable investigative bureau and take everything I've got on the subject and find out what the truth is of what is going on here, because there is something very seriously wrong. Either we have a huge amount of tax uncollected on profits made, or we have a vast amount of money festering away in the European banking system, which is not real money, in which case we need to take it back. My lords, I ask for an investigation, and please support my plea.